Hi, everyone. So I will start my presentation by sharing with you a story of a father who tried to enroll his daughter into the best school he thought. He bought a very expensive apartment in the school district, and the Education Bureau changed the school district. And so this father, who invested a lot of money, time, and energy, thought he was treated unfairly. So he sued the Education Bureau. So in China, it shows how parents can go to lengthy ways in order to get the best resources, education resources for their parents. So really my research is about how parenting in China becomes politics, how parents are empowered by the government to choose and find the best resources, the education resources for their children, and then get into politics in order to obtain those resources. So in China, the government talks a lot about how education is here to improve the quality of the population. So it's an authoritarian regime empowering parents for getting best education. Parenting practices become politics. How does this happen? So after an immersive fieldwork of 8 months in China, I was able to observe 3 ways in which parents become political actors. First, through production of knowledge. Parents define what is a good parent and what is a bad parent. They define what is a good school and what is a bad school. They define also different practices that are the best strategies. Through also solidarity networks. So in this picture, you can see parents learning from model parents. So you have those model parents who are selected because they have the best children. Those children are successful. And so those parents are learning. They're like in the process of really producing knowledge, but also creating solidarity among them. A third way, which I've observed, is how parents become actors within the surveillance state. So we know China as a surveillance state. In the second picture, you can see feeds from video surveillance cameras that are in the different classrooms where parents, when they're waiting for their child to go out of their classroom, they can actually see what's happening in the classroom, and they can monitor what the teacher is doing, what their child is doing, and then come back to the teacher, oh, I did not appreciate how my child was doing, but also how the teacher was teaching and the practices what's happening. So they really become part of the surveillance state that is currently happening in China. So in the end, what I want to show is how in China we think how political actors are usually dissident or officials and not really everyday life person. But here I show how parents become political actors in their everyday lives in the way they choose education for their child. Thank you very much. And,
So there's a general belief within Canadian society that the Liberal Party of Canada is the supposed party of multiculturalism and diversity. Yet we seldom actually ask ourselves if visible minorities, i.e. the people multiculturalism sought to include in the first place, even actually believe that. In fact, we seem to know fairly little about visible minorities' political attitudes in general. While yes, we do know that they have a tendency to prefer the Liberal Party more so than other Canadians, we don't even know actually why that is the case. Using survey data from over 5,000 respondents, of whom over 2,000 were from a visible minority background, my master's thesis seeks to develop a more nuanced and sophisticated portrait of visible minorities' political attitudes in Canada. My findings show that even in 2014, visible minority Canadians still had a much greater propensity to support the Liberal Party when compared to other Canadians. And that this gap in Liberal support was not explained by social demographic factors such as gender or income, nor was it explained by social values or even differences in economic ideology. What then explains this gap in Liberal support between visible minorities and other Canadians? One hypothesis suggests that, well, visible minorities support the Liberal Party because the Liberal Party is the supposed party of multiculturalism and diversity. I test this hypothesis in 2 ways. First, I looked at visible minorities' opinion of multiculturalism and its effect on Liberal support. My findings showed that even though visible minorities did tend to have much more positive opinions of multiculturalism in general, it had little to no effect in affecting their level of Liberal support. My second measure, which was that of ethnic identification, or how closely visible minorities felt attached to their ethnic community was, however, a significant predictor of liberal support. As such, whereas visible minorities with a strong sense of ethnic identification tended to support the liberals, those with a weaker sense of ethnic identification tend to support the conservatives on the other hand. This finding suggests that whereas visible minorities with a strong sense of ethnic belonging will prioritize their group's collective interests and thus continue to support the liberals because they view the Liberal Party as being the party of minorities, those with a weaker sense of ethnic identification and arguably a more individualistic outlook on politics in general will instead emphasize more personal level values such as social conservatism and economic ideology. In this sense, whereas visible minorities with a strong sense of belonging with their community continue to be something of an outlier when compared to other Canadian voters, those with a more individualistic outlook on politics might not actually be that much different from other Canadians. Thank you.
What does this picture have to do with politics? A picture of Kathleen Wynne running? What does running through a park have to do with running for premier? Well, for Wynne, it meant a whole heck of a lot. In fact, when it comes to politics, the phrase, "a picture's worth 1,000 words," is not merely cliche. Research actually shows that visuals can be much more effective than text for political communication. This phenomenon, known as the picture superiority effect, suggests that a single photograph can communicate a significant amount of political information to voters and ultimately affect their electoral decisions. Recognizing the persuasive potential of visual content, political actors from around the world have employed professional staff to craft visuals that appeal to the electorate. Despite this evidence, only a modicum of research has analyzed how political actors are using visual content to promote a strategic image of themselves online. Accordingly, my research addresses this gap by exploring how party leaders in the 2018 Ontario provincial election presented themselves in photo-based tweets. And what I found was, well, photos are important. In fact, 45% of tweets included a photo. Now, overall, this photo wasn't typical in the research that I did. Generally, all three leaders presented themselves outside of, as statespersons, that is, capable of assuming political office. Nearly half of the tweets were coded as such. In these photos, we see the leaders doing such things as attending campaign activities, appearing with other candidates or influential politicians, wearing formal attire, or including patriotic symbols in their photos. However, this finding was rather unsurprising. It's obvious why potential premiers-to-be would want to be perceived as capable politicians. But photos like this still exist. Accordingly, I decided to conduct a second analysis, exploring whether leaders visually presented themselves outside of being a statesperson. In my research, I discovered that all three leaders employed markedly different strategies to differentiate themselves from being a statesperson. So what's happening here? Why would Kathleen Wynne post a picture of her running? Well, at 65, a decade older than the rest of the leaders, it was important for Wynne to appear spry, young, and relatable. And I argue that Wynne posted photos such as this to distance herself from popular and journalistic depictions of her that were detrimental to her political image, such as her older age. Thus, my research argues that all three leaders attempted to use photos to enhance qualities that were beneficial and counteract qualities that were negative to their self-presentation. In fact, if you believe me that a picture is worth 1,000 words, then running through a park is the exact same thing as running for political office. Thank you, guys.
Hello, everyone. Perhaps most of you have heard about Al-Qaeda, or you've seen the face of Osama bin Laden, the leader of the organization, on TV. Back in the 1980s, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the US and a couple of regional allies, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, decided to arm some Afghan mujahideen in Afghanistan in order to push the Soviet Union back from Afghanistan. Mission was accomplished. Soviet Union eventually pulled out of Afghanistan. However, mujahideen did not disband. They actually evolved into what we know today as Al-Qaeda. September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda launched terrorist attacks on a number of targets in the United States. So the rebel group turned against the initial sponsor. Fast forward to 2011, when popular uprisings broke out in Syria and Libya, we saw once again a number of states were providing support to rebel groups in these two countries. Some of them to remove the despotic rulers, some of them wanted to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. So to figure out if this is a pattern of foreign policy behavior, I developed a data set for my research. That data set consists of all cases of non-state armed groups that received support from states from 1980 to 2017. I identified different types of support. I also identified different categories of unintended consequences. Surprisingly, in 77% of the cases, there have been some unintended consequences happening after external support. And even more surprisingly, the top sponsoring states were actually the ones that faced the worst type of unintended consequences. So why don't they learn the lessons? Why do they keep doing the same thing, despite the fact that it is likely that it might blow up in their face? I use the concept of role in foreign policy analysis to explain this complicated foreign policy behavior. By examining the official statements of the state leaders of these top sponsoring states, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States, I found that these states' leaders have particular understanding of their national role in the international system. This unique conception of role actually leads them to engage in support of rebel groups in other countries. And this particular national role conception includes tasks, responsibilities, and also provides a range of foreign policy alternatives to these decision makers. By looking at different alternative options available to these foreign policy decision makers in these states, I found out that providing support to rebel groups is in fact the least bad option for them. Thank you.